Hey everybody, how's it going? So this is another one of these patron request videos that I'm doing. Um, as I've said before, as part of the Patreon perks that I have, if you want me to tackle a subject or an issue, typically of a theological or philosophical nature, you can have me do a stream on it, a reaction stream to some content relating to the issue, or I can just do a video on it, like a standalone video on it. And that's for the $10 a month Patreon tier. So if that's something that you're interested in, if you want to hear my take on some of these topics in the form of like a video or something like that, that's how you can get that perk. And so for this one, I'm going to be tackling the issue of, well, actually, I'm going to be tackling multiple issues here: the death penalty, torture, corporal punishment, generally speaking. I'll touch a little bit on the Inquisition as well, how all of that relates to what the church perennially teaches on all of these things. So we'll go through its historical development, its theological development, and I'm going to try to bring about some kind of synthesis on the matter that can hopefully be helpful to all of you. So just remember, if you like this video at the end, you can give it a like, follow the channel, or hit subscribe, and hit a bell to get a notification when I go live or upload a video. It helps the channel out, but it also will help notify you. So if you want to keep getting updated on the content that I keep making here, and I'm trying to make a lot more of it, definitely do a favor and hit the bell, hit the subscribe button. It does help a lot. And leave a comment too. Tell me what you think. Okay, so what has the church taught, and what does the church teach about these issues? So we're going to start with the issue of corporal punishment. We're kind of just starting on the smallest scale, and we're going to be increasing to the largest scale, which culminates really in the death penalty, right? So starting with corporal punishment, let's first give it a rough and broad definition. Well, I think we can pretty uncontroversially settle this by defining it more or less as the infliction of physical pain or suffering in order to punish or deter undesirable behavior of some kind by a legitimate state actor, or on a very small scale level, within the life of the family. This can be as mundane as spanking your children, or it can be as grave as something like state-sponsored terror. And so it does cover a pretty wide spectrum here. Considered purely in itself, we can pretty safely say that the church doesn't in any way consider the mere use of corporal punishment to be a moral evil. I mean, you can find up and down the scriptures in various forms. For example, references to this. You find it in the book of Proverbs, which explicitly exhorts us to spare not the rod when it comes to the discipline of children. Now, this is not necessarily to say that every parent has to make use of some kind of corporal punishment to deter unruly behavior, but it does mean that it would be contrary to the inspired word of God to consider recourse to this action as somehow per se contrary to the gospel. And actually, Pope Francis, to my knowledge, is kind of like the only pope who's addressed that issue of like spanking children in particular. He does look on it favorably, of course, within due moderate limits. And I'm not giving a commentary on what are the best practices in that area from like the standpoint of child psychology or something like that. I'm just interested here for these purposes on the moral theology of it. So I think that issue is pretty easily just dealt with. It's pretty straightforward. But as we got done saying earlier, corporal punishment covers a very wide spectrum of behavior. And so when we get into this whole issue of torture, the church's teaching on this matter becomes a bit more ambiguous and honestly kind of confusing. So let's go over the history a bit before getting into the moral theology. And I want to preface this by crediting Dr. Brian Harrison for doing a lot of work in studying this issue and bringing forth a lot of historical facts and theological data pertaining to the issue. So while I am providing my own original synthesis in light of these facts, he's done an amazing job piercing to the heart of this topic. So let's go into the history a bit. Well, in the early patristic era, it shouldn't surprise us that you often see on a wide variety of issues, but specifically on this issue of state-sponsored violence, you see a conflation of counsel and precept. And we'll get into that distinction a little bit later. And so you have Tertullian and others with him that condemn not only the use of corporal punishment, but also other acts of war that would, under the current magisterium that has been developed now for well over 1,000 years, would be considered allowable under a just work framework. It really isn't until Augustine that you see this distinction between counsel and precept, specifically in this area, to emerge. And I'm going to quote him here. Augustine, for example, says the following, quote, just one second here. Quote, "The accused is tortured to discover whether he is guilty, so that though innocent, he suffers most undoubted punishment for crime that is still doubtful, not because it is proved that he committed it, but because it is not ascertained that he did not commit it. Thus the ignorance of the judge frequently involves an innocent person in suffering, and even in death when the accused falsely confesses a capital crime out of sheer terror of unendurable pain. If such darkness shrouds social life, will a wise judge take his seat on the bench or no? Beyond question he will, for human society, when he thinks it a wickedness to abandon, constrains him and compels him to this duty. These numerous and important evils he does not consider sins, for the wise judge does these things not without any intention of doing harm, but because his ignorance compels him, and because human society claims him as a judge. So there are twofold reasons there. And if he is compelled to torture and to punish the innocent because his office and his ignorance constrain him, is he happy as well as a guiltless man?" So what you have here is you can see that while Augustine would definitely consider the use of torture, specifically torture as a means of eliciting a confession of some sort, while he does consider that beneath the ideals of the gospel, and of course if a judge knows someone to be innocent, he would obviously consider that to be sinful in itself, right? But specifically as a magistrate of the state, he doesn't seem to consider a judge who issues such a ruling as to be branded with the guilt of grave sin. And while he would certainly say that the judge would act more virtuously to rule against such a measure, he doesn't consider a ruling in its favor to always and everywhere be sinful. And it's this distinction between counsel and precept, in my judgment, which should serve as a filter through which we see not only the issue of corporal punishment, but also the death penalty and even engaging in warfare, generally speaking. And we'll say more on this later, though. Following Augustine's development here, and he addresses the issue elsewhere too, and he broadly comes to the same conclusion. But following Augustine's development, Christendom as a whole, after Constantine, following Constantine, seemed to follow this approach when it came to dealing with the Roman legal tradition that it had inherited throughout the fall of the Roman Empire. Fast forward to Pope Nicholas I, and you get what I would consider to be the first magisterial treatment of this issue. Now, what you find here, though, is nothing short of an absolute condemnation of the use of torture. And Pope Nicholas I says the following, quote, "If a putative thief or bandit is apprehended and denies the charges against him, you tell me your custom is for a judge to beat him with blows to the head and tear the sides of the body with other sharp iron goads until he confesses the truth. Such a procedure is totally unacceptable under both divine and human law, since the confession should be spontaneous, not forced. It should be proffered voluntarily, not violently extorted. After all, if it should happen that even after inflicting all these torments, you still fail to wrest from the sufferer any self-incrimination regarding the crime of which he is accused, will you not then at least blush for shame and acknowledge how impious your judicial procedure is? Likewise, suppose an accused man is unable to endure such torments and so confesses to a crime he never committed, upon whom, pray tell, will now devolve the full brunt of responsibility for such an enormity, if not upon him who coerced the accused into confessing such lies about himself. Now, in the case of free men under the suspicion of a crime, if he has already been found guilty of some previous offense, or has not been sentenced to be punished on the testimony of 3 witnesses, or if it is otherwise not possible to convict him, then the matter is finally resolved, placing before the accused the Holy Gospel. Once he swears upon it that he is innocent of the said crime, he is set free. This accords with the apostles to the Gentiles, who had frequently witnessed, an oath serves as a guarantee and puts an end to all argument. He gets that from Hebrews 6:16. So while this seems pretty clear-cut, namely this condemnation, ambiguity begins to enter into the equation when future popes and councils get into the mix, particularly under the pontificate of Pope Innocent IV, who does explicitly allow for the use of confession, extracting, torture in various tribunals for the Inquisition. Now, I want to say a few things about the Inquisition before moving on here. First of all, there were not millions killed in the Inquisition. Best estimates calculate really no more than 5,000, which is not really proportionally on the same level of what's in the public consciousness pertaining to the Inquisition. And furthermore, it was not even the church herself that carried out these executions. If anything, the role of the Inquisition was helpful for the accused in that it provided the accused with some means of ascertaining the truth of the situation, as well as providing the accused with ample opportunity to repent and therefore to avoid sentencing. And the punishments that were carried out, they were carried out by the secular power, not the ecclesiastical power. And when you think about it on a more political level, it was in the state's interest to punish heresy, just as it's in the state's best interest today to punish something like treason. From the standpoint of the state, when it formally embraces something like the Catholic faith as integral to its very identity, well then it has to be said that public and manifest attacks against the Orthodox Catholic faith would then constitute a very grave and serious threat to the state's own legitimacy. Just as today the U.S. government would consider it a national security threat if influential cultural or intellectual actors were attempting to undermine the public's faith and say, I don't know, constitutional republicanism or the electoral process. I mean, we're very familiar with this kind of scaremongering today. So when the concept of heresy is understood within this framework, it makes a bit more sense why the state would treat something like heresy with such a degree of gravity. And even, the infamous Spanish Inquisition, going back to this issue of death toll, that only reached about, it didn't exceed even the hundreds. So, in historical hindsight, I think this whole canard is just unfair and unserious when it's used to attack Catholicism. But going back to this issue of torture here, you do have this disciplinary allowance for it under Innocent IV, but when you look at magisterial interventions on this topic after that, you really find nothing but condemnation, especially when it's speaking about it on the doctrinal level. And so you had implemented in the 1917 Code of Canon Law prohibition of it. And of course you have Gaudium et Spes, the Second Vatican Council, Pope John Paul II, Pope Pius XII as well, speak out against it very forcefully. And so I think you can say on the purely doctrinal level, specifically confession eliciting torture is condemned. And even when you look at the discipline of Pope Innocent IV, that's not a universal ecclesiastical discipline. As we know, ecclesiastical disciplines, when they're universal and imposed on the whole church, those do constitute a category that is protected from error by the Holy Spirit. But this isn't that. I mean, it was a very targeted allowance aimed at some localities. It didn't rise to the level of a universally binding ecclesiastical discipline. So it evades that, and it also evades magisterial status, because it didn't rise to the level of doctrinal teaching on part of the Pope. So all you really have are condemnations of confession eliciting torture. And I think that can apply broadly to torture as well, just as a general disciplinary practice on part of the state. And I think the only arguable exception to that might be found in Pope Leo X's condemnation of Luther's errors, and one of those says that the heretics be burned is against the will of the Spirit. And we'll get to that again when we talk about capital punishment, but specifically as it relates to torture leading to execution, it's important to keep in mind that those errors had a global censure, and so we don't really know at what level such an error was even condemned. Like, it could have been just condemned as like scandalous or something like that. And also, it's not entirely clear to me that that death by burning is necessarily part of that decree. I think when you get at, okay, what is the theological content of that proposition, it's really getting at the execution of heretics, the death penalty for heretics. And that's an issue that we're going to talk about in a minute. Okay. So, so what exactly is the source of confusion here? Well, like I said, at one point you have the condemnation of the use of torture by Pope Innocent IV, or rather by Pope Innocent I, Nicholas I, not Innocent, sorry, by Pope Nicholas I, and then you have an allowance for it under Pope Innocent IV, and then you have, again, condemnations of it throughout the rest of church history. So that's the source of confusion that I think I've been able to address here. So I think that suffices on the issue of torture. Now let's move on to the issue of the death penalty, and this is where the rubber hits the road, so to speak, in terms of a Catholic being presented, in my view, with a true theological quandary. I don't wish to sugarcoat this, because I do consider the doctrinal confusion surrounding this topic to be really an indisputable fact. And covering this up can only do damage to others considering the Catholic faith. So I personally refuse to treat this issue as if it's somehow self-evidently coherent with the hermeneutic of continuity that I've mentioned above. I think it is difficult. And so what is the source of that confusion? Well, put very simply, the Church once taught unambiguously that recourse to the death penalty was a matter of justice, and therefore cannot be considered sinful unless carried out excessively or without due process. And now, the papacy teaches that recourse to the death penalty, to use Pope Francis's terminology, is, quote, morally inadmissible, unquote. And lest anybody say that the laicity of the death penalty was only taught by various theologians or biblical commentators of the church's past, we do have magisterial interventions that affirm the very same teaching. Take, for instance, Pope Innocent III's Professio Fidei, Profession of Faith, prescribed to the Waldensian heretics. One of the preconditions for full communion with the Catholic Church was that the Waldensians had to affirm that the state's exercise of the death penalty can be carried out without sin. And to quote it directly, quote, With regard to the secular power, we affirm that it can exercise a judgment of blood without mortal sin, provided that in carrying out the punishment it proceeds not out of hatred, but judiciously, not in a precipitous manner, but with caution." Unquote. So it's worth noting here that professions of faith, which is what this is, are typically regarded as exercises of the definitive organ of the magisterium, infallible and irreformable in themselves, and therefore not subject to future magisterial reverses. And this is, of course, also affirmed not only by magisterial documents, but also by sacred scripture, which in countless places affirms its, per se legitimacy. And more recently, this same teaching was affirmed many times by Pope Pius XII. And I'll just read a brief quote from him on the issue. He says, quote, "Even when it is a question of the execution of a condemned man, the state does not dispose of the individual's right to life. In this case, it is reserved to the public power to deprive the condemned person of the life in expiation of his crime, when by his crime he has already disposed himself of the right to live." Unquote. Now, since the Second Vatican Council, however, the popes have tried to chart a middle ground position with respect to the death penalty, honoring the Church's perennial teaching on the one hand, but adding further clarification about the moral limitations that contextualize the otherwise morally legitimate act of capital punishment. So, for example, you have Pope John Paul II, and he had this to say about capital punishment, quote, "The traditional teaching of the Church does not exclude, presupposing full ascertainment of the identity and responsibility of the offender, recourse to the death penalty, when this is the only practicable way to defend the lives of human beings effectively against the aggressor. If instead, bloodless means are sufficient to defend against the aggressor and to protect the safety of persons, public authority should not limit itself to such means, because they better correspond to the concrete conditions of the common good and are more in conformity to the dignity of the human person. Today, in fact, given the means at the state's disposal to effectively repress crime by rendering inoffensive the one who has committed it, without depriving him definitively of the possibility of redeeming himself, cases of the absolute necessity for the suppression of the offender today are very rare, if practically non-existent." And he said this in Evangelium Vitae. While one might quibble with this in that it does ignore the other dimension of justice that capital punishment fulfills, namely retributive justice, it nevertheless is carefully crafted enough to safeguard the definitive teaching of Innocent III and other popes, commentators, and most importantly, the plain reading of Scripture. And what it also does is it lays the groundwork for pushing the Church in a direction that tends to favor mercy, which is actually the position of St. Augustine, who, while acknowledging the legitimacy of capital punishment, nevertheless supported a preference for mercy over punishment in as many cases as possible. And even if you're thinking that favoring life in prison over capital punishment doesn't actually sound more merciful, which is where my sympathies tend to lie, honestly. Cardinal Ratzinger at the time explicitly acknowledged that the Pope there was not intending to bind the consciences of the faithful necessarily, but to present what he considers to be the best prudential and pastoral approach to dealing with this issue. And on such a basis, therefore, a Catholic, Ratzinger said, could, in good conscience, part ways with John Paul II's prudential judgment while remaining in good conscience and therefore in good standing with the Catholic Church. Then enter Pope Francis. And I want to preface this by saying this is where the issue gets genuinely confusing and frustrating, in my opinion. And in my view, it does constitute one of the worst blunders of the Francis pontificate. Now, I'm very careful when it comes to critiquing Francis, as all of you know. I try to leave that sort of as a last resort, but on this issue, I think there's no other way but to be critical. Because we had initially a perfectly balanced and sufficiently nuanced theological synthesis on the question that was offered by Pope John Paul II. And to be frank, that synthesis that we had was rather undermined by Pope Francis. And let's begin on that with his change to the Catechism. Francis had updated the Catechism of the Catholic Church on this issue of capital punishment, and now it says the following, quote, "Recourse to the death penalty on part of legitimate authority following a fair trial was long considered an appropriate response to the gravity of certain crimes and an acceptable, albeit extreme, means of safeguarding the common good. Today, however, there is an increasing awareness that the dignity of the human person is not lost even after the commission of a very serious crime. In addition, a new understanding has emerged of the significance of penal sanctions imposed by the state. Lastly, more effective systems of detention have been developed, which ensure the due protection of citizens, but at the same time do not definitively deprive the guilty of the possibility of redemption. Consequently, the Church teaches in light of the gospel that the death penalty is inadmissible because it attacks the inviolability and dignity of the human person, and she works with determination for its abolition worldwide." Now, there are all sorts of problems with how this is worded. For one, there's no precise, or even imprecise, for that matter, definition that's given for the term inadmissible. This unusual word choice here leads many to think that the Pope is merely opting for an intensification of John Paul II's admonition against the death penalty, still in the prudential order of things. But this interpretation isn't without its difficulties. I mean, for one, the Pope seems to be suggesting that his exhortation to eliminate the death penalty does not so much stem from the modern era's supposed superiority in its ability to mitigate harm to society without recourse to the death penalty, at least not only that, but rather it more stems from the modern era's increased awareness, supposed increased awareness of the dignity of the human person, which presumably has always been of such a caliber that it is of itself incompatible with recourse to capital punishment. In other words, if he's correct here, then the modern era has simply recognized a perennial dignity that was always incompatible with capital punishment. And on this interpretation, the Catechism's change, it comes off as, frankly, contrary to the definitive teaching of the Church, seeing as it would formally contradict Pope Innocent III's profession of faith. After all, if the death penalty's universal inadmissibility stems from the intrinsic dignity of the human person, then it would follow that its immorality would seemingly belong to the natural law. And if it pertains to the natural law, then, how could there be a circumstance under which recourse to capital punishment would be truly licit? So while the Pope here is not formally committing himself to the view that capital punishment is intrinsically evil, there does seem to be a plausible interpretation that is what is being affirmed here, by way of simple logical analysis of the text. There's also the fact that the Pope has used even stronger language in a more non-magisterial context. For example, he has, in one of his addresses, said the following, quote, "It is per se contrary to the gospel, the death penalty, because it entails a willful suppression of human life that never ceases to be sacred in the eyes of the Creator, and which ultimately only God is the true judge and guarantor," unquote. Now, it should be obvious to everyone that if something, or rather, I'll put it this way, that if thing A is per se contrary to thing B, then there are simply no circumstances under which thing A is not contrary to thing B. And the only language I can think of to articulate this relationship would be to say that thing A is intrinsically contrary to thing B. That is always and everywhere contrary to it. And so if the death penalty is per se contrary to the gospel, then it would simply stand to reason that the Pope believes that recourse to capital punishment is intrinsically evil. And if indeed that is what he means, then such a proposition cannot constitute the authentic exercise of the magisterium. It cannot constitute an authentic magisterial act because it would already be overruled by prior definitive magisterium. This is, of course, one solution to the dilemma, but while I think such a conclusion is likely unavoidable on some level, I do think that there is more that can be done so that we can be as obedient as we possibly can be to the will of the Pope on this matter, which is important. But would require, in my view, developing the Pope's teachings here beyond its most plausible reading. It requires, therefore, a synthesis. And I think that if we are to look for the best synthesis here, we should really be looking back to Augustine. Remember, Augustine believed that while the death penalty was per se licit, it did not adequately measure up to the ideal way of living in light of the gospel of Jesus Christ. And in order to make sense of this, it's important for us to hammer home the distinction between counsel and precept that I mentioned a bit ago. A counsel is what pertains to the moral aspiration that is not strictly speaking morally obligatory, but nevertheless does conduce toward higher degrees of Christian perfection beyond what is strictly necessary for salvation. This is very similar to the distinction between, rather I should say, it's one of its applicable scenarios is this distinction between virginity and the married state. While the married state is good in itself, it doesn't rise to the highest level of Christian perfection within the virtue of chastity, which is reserved to the state of virginity. And so the state of virginity is therefore supererogatory, not obligatory, but if cultivated, will attain to higher state of Christian perfection beyond what is necessary. Now, if there are simply no rational reasons that would make a less perfect, morally good choice preferable to the supererogatory choice, then while it may not be necessarily sinful, it would likely constitute a fault or an imperfection to refuse the supererogatory, extra virtuous choice in that scenario. So, transferring this reasoning to the death penalty, if society is such that recourse to capital punishment is completely unnecessary in fulfilling the given society's demand for justice and safety, then while recourse to capital punishment would not in every case be a sin, practical reason would dictate that the state should in such a circumstance work toward its elimination in favor of mercy, seeing as displays of mercy are always preferable in the order of charity, as St. Thomas Aquinas says, so long as justice can still be satisfied, of course. And this is the teaching of Augustine on the issue. And so, if the Pope is correct about his prudential assessment of the criminal justice system, then, and of course about deterrence, then it would be right indeed for him to exhort the nations to find ways of punishing offenders without recourse to capital punishment. Such a prudential assessment, though, of course, does lie outside the scope of magisterial authority. And so if the Pope is seriously wrong about his prudential assessment of the situation, then of course a Catholic could be at odds with his prudential judgment based upon such an erroneous assessment and would still be in good standing with the Catholic Church. But we would still be keeping with the moral principles that I've just articulated. In other words, in such a situation, there may simply be too many extenuating circumstances that make the supererogatory choice inadmissible, as opposed to making the merely lawful course of action inadmissible. This, it seems to me, is the best way to navigate through the Church's teachings on this issue. And like I said, it does require, or at least it seems to require, developing the Pope's teachings beyond their most plausible reading. But it seems to me that this would be the only way to square the circle and would actually circle us back to the teaching of Augustine, which seems to be a pretty safe place to be. If I'm wrong on this issue, in the comments, you can feel free to correct me on it. I'm always open to adhering to what the Pope says and teaches on these things, if it's possible to remain in keeping with the definitive teachings of the Church. You can check out my video that I did a while back on how I think the charism of magisterial safety actually works and how it is compatible with the situation in which the Pope attempts a materially heretical teaching. And in such a case, that teaching, having been already overruled by the definitive magisterium, wouldn't really constitute a magisterial act. So it wouldn't really be the magisterium teaching an error, right? And for an explanation on that, you can check out that video. But I think this is the best explanation and synthesis that one could give. And again, if I'm wrong about the Pope's teaching on this, if he actually is affirming what I've just said, then great. But I think that what I've just articulated is the only way that a Catholic can simultaneously accept the reservations about the death penalty that have come out of the magisterium, but also recognizing what the magisterium has said in the past about the intrinsic moral legitimacy of the death penalty. So that's my treatment of the issue. I hope you found it helpful. I hope you found it useful. If you did, leave a like on the video. Subscribe if you like the content. Helps out the channel. Hit the bell for notifications when I go live or upload a video. If you want, like I said, that Patreon perk for me doing a video or a stream request of your choosing, you can sign up for my Patreon. And also at the $5 level even, you get monthly book recommendations. You get unlimited access to Q&A with me one-on-one through DMs or whatever. And also you get detailed notes for all of the streams and the content that I do. And what I'm also going to add to it is I've been working on 100 pages of catechetical notes as well. And I'm going to add that to the $5 tier. So if that's of interest to you, it's like 100 pages of detailed catechetical notes that's very helpful for somebody considering Catholicism or entering into the church. You can get that by becoming a patron. So hope it was helpful, and God bless you.